but let's hope it goes really well. Really delighted to be here and speak on this important subject, even more so at the moment, considering we're in the biggest health crisis that any of us remember. So I just wanted to flag at the outset, in case anyone isn't familiar with the CIPD, this is our purpose, and it's to champion better work and working lives. And if we're going to take that seriously, which we very much do at the CIPD, then improving the health and well-being of people at work across the UK has to be, and beyond, has to be central to that purpose. And we have a membership of over 150,000 members in workplaces across the world to make that a reality, and that's very important. Now, as Lee said, I'm going to set the scene to talking about the important issue of improving productivity through health and wellbeing investment. And to do that, I'm going to draw on our research, mainly our practitioner research, which looks at the state of the nation's health and wellbeing in the workplace and how is it positioned in organisations? How seriously do organisations take people's health and wellbeing? How much do they invest in this area? And this is our annual survey to give you some of the key findings to answer those questions. This survey is in its 20th year. We've been running it for 20 years at the CIPD, and we've surveyed over 1,000 organisations, and collectively that represents around 4.5 million employees in UK workplaces, and it's through the eyes of HR professionals, so they can give us really important insight through first-hand experience into the state of people's health and wellbeing and what they do around health and wellbeing in their organisation. Now, we carried out the field work just before COVID, before the pandemic, so do bear that in mind as I'm talking. Now, the first graph I want to show you is very pertinent to the subject of this webinar. It shows the impact of health and wellbeing activity over the past year. So it's the view of HR professionals in terms of what they feel have been the main outcomes of their investment in workforce health and wellbeing. And first of all, importantly, around 90% of organisations said that there have been positive outcomes through the investment they've made in health and wellbeing. And if you look at some of the top ones, really important in terms of improving organisational effectiveness. So we've got better employee morale and engagement, a healthier, more inclusive culture, lower sickness absence, and then a whole other in descending order of achievements. And if you think that, okay, improved productivity, around 22% said that that had been an outcome, but actually all these outcomes are interrelated. So lower sickness absence as well can contribute to better performance, more cost effectiveness. So these don't exist in isolation, these outcomes. They have to be looked at as a whole, really, in terms of improving organisational performance. They're all interlinked. And then as part of building a business case for organisations and senior leaders to be convinced of the need to invest in people's health and wellbeing, evaluation is a really important part of building that business case, because you can't manage what you don't measure. Now, in last year's survey, we did a deep dive into evaluation. So we looked at how many organisations carry out any evaluation of the kind of interventions they implement around health and wellbeing. We looked at the outcomes that they see as a result of that. And we did find, unfortunately, that not enough organisations do a thorough evaluation of their health and wellbeing activity. So they don't take an evidence-based approach, which is what you need to build that robust business case. Less than a third actually evaluate the impact of their health and wellbeing programme, so not very high. And less than a quarter, for example, assess the quality of the outcomes for employees who participate in the kind of health and wellbeing initiatives that they've got in place. And that is a risk for HR, because if you don't know whether what you're putting in place is making a difference and improving health and wellbeing amongst employees, you don't know if it's effective. You don't know if it's having an unintended effect, actually. So it's really important to look at the impact of health and wellbeing and what you're doing in that space. Now, just to go back to setting the scene, because what I'm really going to do is take you through quite briefly some of the key findings from that survey to look at how health and wellbeing is positioned in organisations. Now, first of all, a key finding is around sickness and absence. And we find that at 5.8 days sickness absence per employee per year, sickness absence is actually at an all-time low. It's the lowest ever recorded in the history of our 20-year survey. Now, you might think, oh, is that great news? Does that mean everybody's healthier now because they're taking less sickness absence? Not necessarily at all. It might be in some organisations. A lot more organisations are doing a lot more to invest in people's health and wellbeing, yes, but a real key message for the CIPD from some of the findings, which I'll take you through, is that you can't rely on sickness absence data alone to look at how healthy or not your employees are. You've really got to look underneath the surface. And you can see why if I just look at some of the other findings here, because our report also finds that nearly 9 in 10 respondents, HR professionals, have seen presenteeism in their organisation, which is people working when they're unwell. And there's more and more evidence emerging around this unhealthy working practice now. It really isn't healthy if you're working when you feel ill. And an organisation really has to look at why that is happening if it is the case. And then the second bullet, almost 3/4 of HR professionals are seeing leavism in their organisation. By leavism, we mean using holidays to work or working when you're supposed to be off sick. So it's just being tethered to the office digitally when really you're supposed to be on leave or off sick. And again, this isn't the sign of a healthy working practice, because people need to take time off. You need to switch off from work, do other things, whatever you do to unwind, take your leave. It's very difficult for people to go on holiday at the moment, but actually it's even more important to have a break from work. It's not healthy to be continually on that treadmill. But what we also see is that if you look at the third bullet point, a lot of organisations are really uncertain about how to tackle these quite systemic issues in many organisations. Only a third are taking steps to actually discourage presenteeism and leavism in their organisations. So we want to see more action around that. Now, if we look at the causes of long-term absence, because it's still very important to look at this as one of the measures to assess health and well-being, see where you need to take more action to support good health and well-being. Long-term absence, so 4 weeks or more, what are the main causes? I've just put the top 5 up here. We have mental ill health, musculoskeletal injuries, stress, and acute medical conditions as the top 4. And you can see from that immediately that 2 of the 3 top causes of long-term sickness absence are psychological, mental ill health and stress. And this just confirms what we know from other evidence as well, that the main risks to people at work now are psychological. So it's really important that organisations are aware of that and have in place the right kind of interventions and support to prevent these kind of risks to our health. And then if we look at mental health in a bit more detail, because it's really important that we do that in the context of the pandemic as well, because the risks are not just to people's physical health at the moment. 60% in this survey reported an increase in common mental health conditions among employees. Now, this was before, as I said, the pandemic. So we can see already that mental ill health, common mental health conditions like anxiety and depression, real cause for concern in UK workplaces. Now, at the same time, I also want to caveat this finding with the fact that over the last few years, we've seen a steady increase in the proportion of organisations that are raising awareness about mental health, taking more action in this area, educating managers and so on about mental health. Now, hopefully that is contributing to a culture that is more open around mental health, where people may be more ready to talk about mental health and even disclose a mental health condition. So that could be partly, hopefully, contributing to this figure as well. But I do just want to talk about mental health a little bit. I'm sorry, I don't know why it's done that. We're back again. Technology isn't always our best friend. And if we move on, this is the most common causes of stress, because we're seeing stress increase as well, again, before the pandemic. And we can see what are the causes. That's what the slide is showing. By far the biggest cause is workloads, volume of work. So we know the intensity of work for many people has increased over the recent timescale. And then we can see management style is a cause of stress in many cases as well. And then we have outside work factors like relationships, family, personal illness, health issues. Also, relationships at work can be a cause of stress, targets and deadlines. It'll be really interesting to see when we report on the next year's findings in a few months, how these have changed considering the pandemic and the pressure that will have put on many people, both at work and outside of work as well. So I'm expecting to see some changes when we report next time on these. But I feel at the moment, given that we are in the midst of such a huge mental health crisis, as well as a physical health crisis, that we need to talk about the risks to people's mental health at the moment as well. Because many people's mental well-being will have been affected in a myriad of different ways since the onset of the pandemic. And some people will have developed conditions like anxiety or depression. And Mind, the mental health charity, are urging employers to recognise that we are in a mental health emergency as well, that we haven't even seen peak yet. And we have to think long term about the impact of the crisis on people's mental well-being. Now, that kind of picture is reflected in our own research at the CIPD as well, because as well as the annual survey that I've been talking about, we're also carrying out monthly surveys to gauge the response of employers to COVID-19, and also what is the state of people's health at work and how are they dealing with the crisis. Now, first of all, we're finding nearly 9 in 10 employers are concerned about people's mental health at work. So it's very high on the agenda of HR professionals. There is a great deal of concern about obviously people's physical health, but also their mental health at the moment. And now when we survey on a monthly basis employees as well to get their view, we're finding a lot of anxiety, heightened anxiety about, for example, returning to a workplace. There's a lot of discussion at the moment as well about, are more people going to return to a physical workplace? And in London in particular, we're finding a lot of heightened concern about using public transport. It's not surprising if we look at the last bullet point that the concern is, and anxiety is much higher where people have already got a health condition. So in particular, if they have a mental health condition, and that concern about returning to a physical workplace is not subsiding. And it was as high in June when we last surveyed employees as it was back in March and April. So employers really need to be aware of that concern when they're discussing any kind of return to a workplace. Now, I also want to touch on some findings from the survey to talk about how critical it is that organisations have in place really good, competent people management approaches, because people managers really are key to dealing with those concerns, to putting in place all the sort of changes that some employees may need to support their health and well-being. Line managers in particular have got a really important role to play here. And we're finding, even before the pandemic, year after year in our research, that there is increasing responsibility on line managers to implement all the support and people management policies that are going to make a real difference to people's health at work, and how connected, how engaged, as well as how healthy they feel in the workplace. And if you think about it, most managers now, with responsibility for people management devolved down the line, they are the main link between the organisation and each individual who works there. So they will have responsibility for managing absence, for managing a return to work after sickness, for responding to disclosure about a health condition, including around mental health, and for managing workloads. If you think back to the causes of stress, volume of work and workloads, and management style as well. So how they go about their job is going to have a really big impact in terms of how healthy people feel. And what we're finding is that although there's a big expectation on line managers, it isn't always supported by enough investment to help them feel capable and competent and confident to actually rise to that challenge and really deliver good mental health and good physical health as well, and implement all those people management policies. And if I just give you an example on the next slide, this again shows some key findings in terms of line manager confidence and the investment in them in terms of well-being in organisations. So around 58% of people professionals, HR, think that line managers have really bought into the importance of well-being in their teams. And then in terms of what HR think, less than a third think that managers are able to have those sensitive conversations and then signpost people to having access to the sort of expert help that they might need to support their health. And then only a quarter of managers are confident to spot the early warning signs of mental ill health and distress. So not a great vote of confidence in how capable line managers are to carry out this important role for employee well-being. So we are calling for more investment in line managers. But then what is the role of line managers? Just to finish this presentation. First of all, it's important to say what the role of line managers isn't. And we're not expecting line managers or HR professionals either to be experts on health, to be medical experts or counsellors, far from it. Part of the skill is knowing where the line lies between listening, having empathy, and so on, dealing with disclosures about ill health, yes, but not giving expert or medical advice. They need to know when to signpost on, refer to occupational health or an employee assistance programme, and so on, where needed. They really need to know that, or they could be under far too much pressure. And then build relationships based on trust. This is so fundamental to how supported people feel at work, that line manager relationship that you have is going to be really pivotal to how engaged, how valued you feel, and able to have really honest conversations about your work and managing workloads, deadlines, all those practical elements of your job, but also being able to feel honest in how you can discuss how you're feeling as well. And if you need to get some more support or you need changes to your work or working arrangements. So trust is fundamental. And then leading by example. We need line managers who do role model healthy behaviour, who can set really good expectations of behaviour amongst their teams, who will go about their role in a healthy way and will take leave and won't be emailing when they're on leave and or expecting staff to touch in with the organisation when they're supposed to be on leave. So we really do follow the role models that our managers and senior managers set. So leading by example, but with empathy as well and compassion. So how your manager treats people will really set the tone for how you relate to each other within your team as well. This is a time where we need the most empathy and understanding and compassion and kindness, given how concerned a lot of people will feel at the moment, given the wider situation. And then sensitive and supportive one-to-ones, another really important area, because that is the forum for somebody to discuss any kind of ongoing support or change that they need. You do need that one-to-one, open and trust-based conversation to happen as often as needed. Now, line managers as well need a lot of ongoing guidance and advice where there are, in particular, complex and challenging situations in their teams. And we're going to see more of that at the moment, considering the many complexities that a lot of us are dealing with, particularly in view of more people returning to a physical workplace where we have the risk of infection from COVID still very much present. A lot of people have caring responsibilities still. Some people might have been shielding and that is paused now. So some very complex individual situations for managers to deal with. Really important that HR and senior management as well are there to provide the ongoing advice and support to them. Line manager wellbeing is so important as well, because those operational demands haven't gone away either. So as well as the people management role that line managers have, there could be even more pressure on them at the moment to deal with all the operational and difficult trading situations that many organisations are going to be in. And we often find from our research that line managers are the squeezed middle. So they're under pressure from above operationally, but also they've got this really important people management role that they're often not given enough time and space and support to deliver on. So line manager wellbeing and making sure that managers know where to get support from as well, and that they can cope with what is expected of them is really important as well, and HR are in a really strong position to influence that. Finally, we have great resources on our website, and many of them are free to download for anybody. We have a hub, our COVID-19 resources, that is shown here, and there is a wealth of practical, helpful, free downloadable information on there to help organisations and managers as well. A lot of it is very practical and accessible to help them deal with the situation that we're in at the moment with the pandemic. For members, we have a new wellbeing helpline, and then we have lots of knowledge and content and research and policy reports as well. So that's just a flavour of what we've got on our website. So do visit cipd.co.uk if you are interested in looking at any of those. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'm now going to hand you over to Sarah, who's going to be talking more about the cost effectiveness of evaluating workplace wellbeing interventions. I just touched on this, but Sarah is going to talk in more detail, and I'm going to move the slides on for her.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you everybody for coming along to the webinar today. It was really great to have the scene set so effectively by Rachel, and I've written notes on some of my slides because some of those themes I am going to come back to. The work I'm going to talk about was joint work with colleagues at the University of East Anglia and at the University of Sheffield, and it was conducted as part of our ongoing work with the What Works Wellbeing Centre. And as part of that work, we did rapid and detailed systematic evidence reviews on what kinds of workplace interventions do impact positively on well-being. And one of the rather interesting parallels with what Rachel said about how many organisations conduct evaluations, in the academic literature, although there's quite a lot of discussion about what works in terms of improving well-being, there was hardly ever a costing undertaken, and so there was never a sense in which the cost effectiveness was ever evaluated. So this is rather new work. So I'm going to start by setting the scene on how evaluations are normally conducted, and then what would be different about a wellbeing cost effectiveness evaluation. So Rachel, if we could move on to the next slide, please. Now, I've already warned Rachel, these first two slides, I rather stupidly put animations in. So yes, cost-benefit analysis would be the starting point for an evaluation where you would line up the costs and benefits associated with an intervention. It's used very extensively by government. And although there are quite different components of costs and benefits, the way a cost-benefit analysis is pursued is by attaching a monetary value to both the costs and to the benefits. So little pound signs should appear now. Thank you. And although it certainly is possible to attach a monetary value to costs, certainly, and in a lot of cases benefits, even if things aren't actually bought and sold, we can look to market behaviour, we can look to preferences and the way in which people value goods, either by travelling to them or, for instance, the premium you might pay on a hotel room with a lovely view compared with one that looks across the car park. So there are ways in which we can put monetary values on in particular environmental goods. Then there's the next animation. There's a question about whether in fact we can convert all of the benefits into monetary equivalents. Some of the benefits that we're looking at, particularly when we're thinking about health and well-being, may actually have intrinsic value in themselves and not just the monetary value that could be converted and compared directly with the costs. So if we can move on to the next slide. So the next, what I'd like to talk about is a sort of a development of cost-benefit analysis into a cost-effectiveness analysis. So the starting point remains the same. We look at what were the costs, we attach a monetary value to those. And then we think about the full range of benefits that have accrued as a consequence of the interventions. And rather than translate those into money, we think about what it is that we really value about that intervention. So if it is a health intervention, we're going to be thinking about what does this do to life expectancy? What does this do to the quality of life? And then we assess the benefit of that intervention in terms of the quality adjusted life years. And this is a technique that's used by the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, and it's the fundamental approach to evaluating what treatments are provided under the NHS. And what we did at What Works Wellbeing was to think about what a wellbeing equivalent of that would be. And so what we chose to do was to use a broad measure of well-being, life satisfaction. How satisfied are you with your life today? It's usually measured on a 0 to 10 scale. And we asked about well-being interventions. What difference did it make to life satisfaction, and how long did it last? And that's how we got a well-being, or a WellBe equivalent of the quality adjusted life years. Now, once you've got the costs on one side and you've got your key outcome measure on the other, what we're proposing is you set thresholds of expenditure that are acceptable for delivering these key well-being outcomes. So in the case of health interventions, the NHS and NICE use a threshold of between £20,000 and £30,000 for each additional quality of life year. If a treatment, if a drug offers a quality of life year and it costs less than, say, 25,000, it's approved by the NHS. And so what we're doing with these well-being cost effectiveness is taking a sort of a parallel version of that. We're saying, well, life satisfaction's measured between 0 and 10, so we'll take a 10th as an indicative threshold value. And so if an intervention costs less than £2,500 to deliver a full additional point in life satisfaction for a year, then it's considered to be cost effective. Now that's actually all I'm going to say on the theory. That's a sort of a background. What I'm going to do next is to show you where you can get some material that would help you with a cost effectiveness analysis, and then to go through an example. So like anybody that's got goods to sell, I want to give a shout out to the work of the team that I work with and the What Works Wellbeing. Part of our last year of work with What Works Wellbeing was about developing a toolkit for helping organisations understand how best to implement wellbeing practices, and also how to evaluate the wellbeing initiatives. On this page, on the What Works Wellbeing, you've got a whole lot of very useful background material and some excellent case studies, and also the cost effectiveness calculator. So imagine we actually had a screen in front of us, you'd click on the cost effectiveness calculator and you would see the next slide. And so this is the material that is available on the What Works Wellbeing website. This is just a screenshot which shows you that there's some background blurb about undertaking a cost effectiveness exercise, and then you can click to download the calculator. You can click to download a very short how-to guide, and then you can click to download the user manual, which is a much more extensive step-by-step with a lot of detailed definitions and illustrative examples. Now, before we had all of the technical trouble today, I was planning to actually show you the calculator, but I think it's best at this stage that I just talk you through the principles and allow you to download the calculator yourself. So if we move on to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about the illustration that I'm going to discuss. So this is going to be an illustration of a randomized control trial undertaken by the College of Police on mindfulness apps. There have been lots of assessments, evaluations of mindfulness in general, but rather fewer on mindfulness apps. So this was one of the key objectives with this trial. But another element of the trial was to assess whether generic mindfulness apps like the ones that any of us can download on our phone, whether those were always as useful for specific occupational groups. So would a generic mindfulness app be as useful for people working in the police force as an app that is bespoke, specially designed to try and alleviate some of the particular job related stresses and strains of working in the police force. So my colleague Helen Fitzhugh oversaw the randomised control trial while she was on secondment at the College of Police, and colleagues George Michaelides, Kevin Daniels and myself worked with Helen to evaluate the mindfulness trial. So if we move on to the next slide. So I have to say that every time I think about the bespoke mindfulness app, it always makes me smile that it's called MindFit Cop, like RoboCop, but for your mind. And so the MindFit Cop was the bespoke app for mindfulness. That was trialled against a group that were allocated Headspace, and then there was a control group. These numbers here reflect those who completed the whole trial and completed all of the baseline, end of intervention and follow-up survey. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So in terms of evaluating these interventions, we look first at the costs of the time involved in people participating in the trial. There were three main staff groupings, all with different salary costs, and so it was important to identify the numbers and the groups to correctly cost their time. So those were the participation costs. The next slide, please. Thank you. So then there were some delivery costs just associated with the MindFit Cop intervention, and that was because it was difficult to initially sign on to MindFit Cop, and it took about a week of Helen's time assisting colleagues in setting up the app on their phones. And lastly, next slide please, there were other costs in the case of Headspace subscription fees, and in the case of MindFit Cop, development costs to deliver the bespoke app. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So Rachel's already given quite a clear account of the different ways in which productivity might be enhanced by wellbeing interventions. We actually measured a number of elements of productivity, days of absence, spells of absence, presenteeism, leavism, and we also captured change in productivity. And the first thing that we noticed is a really significant reduction in sickness absence amongst those that undertook the mindfulness treatments. Next slide, please. And also a very significant rise in productivity. Now, these were self-reported rates of productivity, and although I do think these are high over a 6-month period, bearing in mind that presenteeism fell, leavism fell, and we saw this rather big reduction in sickness absence, I think it's fair to say that there were productivity improvements generated by these treatments. Next slide, please. And there were also very significant and sustained improvements in well-being reported in both treatment groups. You can see the immediate improvement in well-being after 10 weeks of using Headspace, but actually by the end of 6 months, the well-being was improved by both groups. It's also useful to note that the control group experienced an improvement in well-being, and that's one of the reasons that having a control group is important, so that you're actually capturing the effects of the trial itself rather than other organisational or societal or economic effects that may be happening at the same time. If we move on to the next slide, please. Now, this is when I would actually have shown you the Excel spreadsheet, but I'm just going to show you the end results instead. So if we move on to the next, thank you very much. So what the cost effectiveness calculator does, if you see the cross in the green area, that's the estimate of the cost effectiveness of MindFitCop. The line that's going through that cross is a sensitivity, a robustness. It's a 95% confidence interval. So anything in the green area is cost effective. Anything in that lower right-hand quadrant is actually cost saving. The productivity benefits that we saw mean that MindFitCop actually saved money. If we move on to the next one. And you can see that with Headspace, the costs were much lower, as we saw. The estimate of the cost effectiveness ratio is even lower in terms of a negative amount, and we're absolutely confident that this actually saves money. So both the MindFitCop and Headspace save money, improved well-being, and as a consequence, MindFitCop was rolled out in the police nationally. Now, I was going to talk about some case studies, but we are a bit short of time. So what I'm going to do is just quickly give you a flavour of what these 3 case studies illustrate, and make those available with the full set of slides should anyone be interested in pursuing them. And the purpose of talking about these case studies was really, I do understand that randomised controlled trials aren't actually the way in which most organisations roll out wellbeing initiatives. At best, what we can hope for is a before and after measure of key metrics. And you don't always capture life satisfaction. There may be other key performance indicators that organisations are interested in, and those are measured instead. And so what these 3 case studies do is just give you a little flavour of different types of interventions and the sorts of costs and benefits that were involved. So if we move on to the next slide. This was a flexi-time initiative, mostly driven through HR, developing new practice training and rolling it out. The main benefits that were reported here were reduced sick days and staff reporting to be much more in control of their work. If we move on to the next one. This was a mental health first aid program. The main costs here were bringing in a trainer, the time involved by people participating in the training, and then the snowballing out of the training across the organisation. 2 main benefits here. One is a big reduction in staff turnover, and the other, and this really speaks to the point that Rachel made about line managers lacking in confidence in dealing with in communicating and managing employees with mental health difficulties, a really significant improvement in managerial confidence in discussing these matters with employees. Next slide, please. So this is perhaps the more extensive intervention that I'm going to discuss. This is a replacement of an old style appraisal system with something more personally linked coaching, personalized well-being plans. It involved bringing in consultants, training and implementation, so it was quite expensive. But you'll see there huge improvements in employee turnover, reductions in staff sickness, big increase in engagement, and some health benefits. And here we can be a little bit more confident that these are associated directly with this initiative, because this was rolled out to a subgroup of employees, and all of those gains relate to the subgroup compared with the organisation as a whole. And so just moving on to my last slide now. So I think that the two presentations here give you a flavour of how wellbeing initiatives have an impact, both in terms of employee engagement, satisfaction and productivity. That the cost effectiveness approach does help in making a business case, and that may be even more important in current economic conditions. And that investment in employee well-being may have other spillover effects. It can lead to improvement in market awareness and in outside work benefits. So there could be spillover effects in terms of how employees get on with their families, how they get on with their social groups, and that these may have ongoing benefits for society more generally. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you both, Sarah and Rachel. Sorry, I was on mute and my video was off, for sharing your insight and for the technology for staying with us. So we've got 5 minutes for some questions, and we've had a couple of questions in the chat and the question and answer. So if I could start with the first one, please, if that's okay. So Angela is asking, given the issues and stressors of work, do you feel that people professionals need to do more to hold to the mirror leadership style, bullying, and take concerns and grievances more seriously? It often seems to employees that people professionals look at protecting the company risk when such issues arise rather than really shining a light on practice that make employees I'm not sure how that is supposed to finish. Make employees ill, through stress and other conditions. Rachel, do you want to start off by commenting on Angela's question and observation?
Yeah, sure. I'm not sure I caught the whole thread of it, but I think it's about managing
the chat box, if you want to read it too. So she's asking, do people professionals need to hold up more of a mirror to poor leadership style bullying and take concerns and grievances more seriously? What are your thoughts on that?
I think at the moment, yes, always, and especially at the moment as well, because we're seeing with the unequal impact that the pandemic is having across workforces, that some people are more affected and in different ways to others. There is the real potential for conflict and really unfair treatment, like you've just mentioned, coming into the fore in workplaces. So this is a huge employment relations challenge for HR at the moment. And I talked about role modelling and the importance of management, senior leadership as well, and HR have got a huge role to play here. And it is going to take a lot of work and effort actually in many organisations, because there are difficult times ahead and the potential for conflict, as I said, is quite considerable. And then you will see popping up these sort of unhealthy, inappropriate types of behaviour as well. So it's really, really important that organisations and HR are on the front foot, have really good policies, really good procedures, but it's the culture as well that's really important. I talked about the importance of trust-based relationships. That has to be really, really underlined, and the kinds of standards of behaviour that are expected at the moment, and that kindness and compassion, but really dealing quickly to resolve any sources of conflict and so on, and doing that informally and equipping everyone, not just managers, to be able to resolve conflict and really tackle head on any instances or hints of bullying, harassment, all those which we know from our research at the CIPD and beyond are a real problem in organisations. And these are, of course, really closely linked to the state of people's health as well. because if you've got those kind of unhealthy behaviours in organisations and conflict, it's going to have a massive detrimental impact on people's health and well-being. So we really need HR to be alert and have effective ways of dealing with them. So good question.
Thank you, Angela, for the question, and thank you, Rachel, for the response. Now, we've got two other questions. One of them I'd like to pose first and then come back to Sarah's one, because I'd like to give Sarah the opportunity to talk. So what is the main strength of Headspace that made it the highly used app for mediation worldwide?
Yes, thank you, Sammy, for the
worldwide.
And mediation. Thank you, Sammy, for the question. I think that there are various qualities of Headspace. It's very easy to use. It covers an enormously wide range of support areas. So it and actually one of the areas that the police found particularly useful were the areas on sleep and on diet. So it has a sort of a much more diverse offering, but also it's an app that you can dip in and out of. So it's flexible in how you can use that.
Okay, no, thank you for that, Sarah. So we're just about out of time, but I would really like to ask Sarah's question and pose it to both of you. So Sarah's question is around a diverse workforce. So Sarah works in an environment that has care staff, maintenance staff, office-based staff, site staff, home visitors. And she finds that when she launches something, she feels that, or it's felt, that perhaps one of the groups has missed out or they've missed their needs. So what would your advice be around this, so that there's no separate silo pieces of work? Or is that the answer, to have separate silo pieces of work? And also she's been adopting a wellness action plan. Is that enough to be doing for now? So if you would both like to give your views on that as your final thoughts.
Yeah, it's a really good question again, and I think it really underlines, well, the challenge for many organisations in the first place in terms of developing wellbeing approaches that are going to really meet the needs of a diverse workforce, because a lot of workforces, of course, are diverse now, not just in terms of the role, but in terms of individual preferences, health needs. And so I think it's really underlining the importance of, first of all, assessing what the health needs are and preferences of your workforce. And it's not done enough, I don't think. And if you do that, then your health and wellbeing programme is far more likely to meet the needs of the different groups. There are different ways, so it's really important to do that. And it might be that you do have a range of different offerings to suit different groups and so on, because not everybody is going to want to participate in the same kinds of offering. So work with your employees, I would say. If you do have a wellbeing champions group, we do at the CIPD, and they are tremendous at helping the organisation develop interventions that are going to fit, that are going to be welcomed, because otherwise people won't participate in them. So we carry out regular surveys and use various ways of engaging people to try and find out what would hit the mark. So really important to do that. And it might mean that you have to sort of tailor the same approach to suit different groups within your organisation, and also have quite a varied menu of different things on offer as well. But yeah, really good point.
Sarah, would you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I mean, I would have said exactly that, and also to think about how best to communicate with the different groups. So if you have developed something that you think will be of particular benefit, let's say to people that are driving, or because you're worried about posture, or things that will be particularly useful to those who are lone workers, then think about the best routes for communicating to those groups, and getting their line manager buy-in, so that it's a multiple prong communication strategy.
Okay, thank you both for those answers. So we have no other questions. So we've run a wee bit over, and I'm very sorry about that, but my goodness, am I relieved that we've got to the end of this, and we've managed to share most of our slides. And for those of you that would, I would encourage you to download the calculator that Sara refers to, and I'm very sorry that technology has not allowed us to look at that today. So apologies for that, but we will be making the slides available to all of you, and the recording, and details of how you can download the calculator. And I'm sure both of our speakers would be prepared to answer any questions, particularly for Sara and her team, who haven't been given you the opportunity to kind of work through some of the tools available. So it just remains for me to thank the speakers, and to thank all of you for participating in the session today. We have a big focus as CIPD around looking at evidence into practice and knowledge into practice, and the working with the PrOPEL Hub is really allowing us to do this, to work with some expert academics in their field around turning that kind of cutting edge, latest evidence and research into practical tips and tools for organisations to use to improve performance, productivity and wellbeing. So please do take the time to visit the PrOPEL Hub to see what other tools and resources are available to you, and look out for future events, and maybe pick up on some events that you have missed. So thank you for participating, and we look forward to speaking to you again. Okay, thank you all. Bye.